school, and in high school were having sex already. I knew that I wanted to get somewhere, and I wanted to sort of get ahead in life, so that I knew that I wanted to be cautious with having sex, because I knew that it would be a distraction, and that a relationship would be a distraction as well. And so I knew of it, and I was familiar with some of my friends that were already involved sexually, but I sort of kept myself distant. So I didn't get involved with a guy real early. I had some self-esteem issues, and I sort of wanted the guy to like me, but I didn't want him to like me so much that we would get involved to that sense, because I knew that it would change where I was going, and I didn't want something to get in the way of the vision that I had.
So you definitely sound like you had your head on straight. But I'm wondering, did any of that?
My mom didn't think that.
Your mom what?
Didn't think that.
Oh. Well, as a mom, looking back on your childhood, I think you did. So, but speaking of your mom, was any of that stuff influenced by what your parents told you? Or again, you just pulled it from watching interactions among your peers and seeing how things were playing out for them, that you realized that you didn't want to be a part of that?
I think it was a mixture. My mom came from a pretty strict Hispanic background, and so I was raised in that. And you know, there were certain things that she said, good girls don't do this and don't do that. And I'm like, well, I don't know. There seems to be a lot of that going on. But at the same time, I realized that I had cousins, I had friends who because they were involved sexually, they weren't going to college, they weren't realizing some of those dreams, so they were going ahead of me. And so I think it was the combination of my mom telling me, you know, you should treat yourself, others, and yourself this way, but also the realization that if you want to get farther, if you want more out of the things that life can offer you, then you have to protect yourself from relationships that can be harmful.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ericka, so did your knowledge about sexual health and things like that come from your parents inside the home, or was it something you learned at school or from your peers?
Yeah, I think all in the same. What I can definitely remember is, of course, as a young girl, being curious about things that you may learn or see in the media and or from your peers, your surroundings. And so I would have conversations with my peers, and we would have questions, and we could very easily go to our parents to ask questions.
Did you say easily? You easily go to your parents? Okay.
Yeah. I don't remember anything being uncomfortable or taboo, if you will. You know, which is one of the reasons, that I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but which is one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we as parents and as community members be open to having dialogue with our young people.
Yeah.
Also back then in probably junior high school, you'd come home with a form for your parents to sign for sex education. And we don't have that anymore, but we had general health classes where there was a textbook and there was an open dialogue and conversation in the classroom. And so just like any other topic, I take that home and discuss with either my sibling or my parents, my mother and my father. And so I think that helps shape part of the reason why I think it's so important that we be vocal and talk to our kids openly.
I do too. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Michael, where did you come to learn about your sexual health?
So I would say I didn't learn much about it, you know, early on in school, nor did I learn about it from my parents. So I come from a single family household. I grew up in the projects. My mother was super religious, and I just think she was not comfortable, you know, having a conversation about sexual activity and sexual health, you know, with her son. So I would say mine came from the streets. You know, when I would hear my friends talking about it, I would hear, you know, older peers in the neighborhood talk about it. And as somebody who was a preteen, you watch music videos and you see all this stuff on the media. And as a young African-American male, you know, I was attracted to girls, you know, and so you hear these different stories, and a lot of my education came from my peers, came from, you know, people who were a little bit, you know, older than me, but my mother and my father was not around to have those conversations. And as somebody that's responsible for providing services to more than 7,500 youth each and every year, I think it's important for parents to have those conversations, or if you feel like you're not the appropriate one, creating a venue or an opportunity for your kids to be able to have those kinds of conversations. And I wish I would have early on. I will say the one thing, like Dr. Rose, that did distract me from engaging in a lot of sexual activity as a preteen is that I was fearful of sexually transmitted diseases, and I was broke then broker. I was broke as broke, and I was afraid of being a young teenage father, and I would tell you that probably scared me more than anything.
That's totally understandable. So we're talking about how where we learned our sexual health from. But my question is, what is too young? I mean, for the most part, like we've all made, well, you've made references to in high school and junior high school. But what about those kids in elementary school? Now in the day and age of the internet and social media, they are exposed to any and everything that they want to know. So what is too young for us as parents to start engaging in that conversation with our children? Anyone's opinion? Anyone can answer, and everyone doesn't have to.
Well, I think that's a really good question, Khrys. You know, just as a parent, for me, thinking about what may have been too young to have a conversation, and or where do you start, where do you begin? For me, I think it's a natural progression of curiosity from your young person when you see particular behaviors with them, and or because of course you have an open relationship that you can talk about absolutely anything, you know,
of course.
When those things come up in conversation, you have to be able and willing to openly discuss them. You can make fun of it in the way that, you know, you have a conversation in age appropriate terms, but I don't think that you should ignore any you know, prevalent thing that you see or that your young person says to you when they're bringing up the topic. I also think it's critical that you, as an adult, pay attention to the media that our young kids are partaking in and what they see, and be on the forefront of that and able to discuss it. You know, what is the saying? There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
You know, listening to music and videos and that, you know, it would be pretty much the same as things that we've endured over time as well.
I can't say that's the easiest thing to do, though. My youngest son, when he was in high school, you know, there are things where I'm like, okay, listening to music, I'm like, okay, that's not appropriate for someone your age, and this, that, and the other. And he was like, Mom, I hear it at school, so you're not really keeping me from listening to it at all. Yeah. So it's like, where do we have a grip on that? Where can we actually control it? But that's a totally different question. I'm sorry. I kind of went somewhere else with that because I was thinking about it. But if either of you, Dr. Rose or Mike, if you want to, you know, expound on the question, if not, we can move on to the next one. Just let me know.
I think she answered it. I would just say that, you know, those conversations are tough to have, right? So I had this conversation today with my mother-in-law and my wife. So I asked my wife, I said, did your mom talk to you about sex? And my mother-in-law response was, absolutely not. I didn't want to give my daughter any ideas. And all I told her was, if you come home pregnant, you're going to have problems. And so I would say, I think it depends on, you know, what generation, what type of household you were brought in. But I would say at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to control what your kids see. And I think it's healthy to have conversations with them about, you know, sex education. And if you're not the right one, whether it's an older sibling or an educator that you might feel comfortable with. But I think not informing your kids about sexual education, in my opinion, is a grave mistake.
So as Dr. Rose, did you want to say something?
I guess I'm thinking about it from a pediatrician standpoint. So I was thinking about it developmentally. So kids don't really understand sex, and they're not able to comprehend it until probably when they start maturing. So they'll come at you with questions about where do babies come from, and it's just the same as how do you make bread. There's not much of a sexuality to it, even if, let's say, I'm going to be quite frank. Let's say that the kid is playing with themselves. They're not relating that to sex. It's not making that connection yet. So that they'll come over and they'll ask what you think, oh my goodness, they're already asking these questions, and they're really not connecting the dots. So when they come over and they ask you that question, then, you know, boil it down for them. So there's a mom part and a dad part, and those two get together and they get inside mom's body, and you know, takes, you know, 9 months, and then a baby comes, and they'll go like, oh yeah, really, wow, mom, and they'll walk away. But that's like a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old. Kids are developing a lot earlier now, so they're starting to develop and have sexual development. We call those Tanner stages, and so they pass from Tanner 1 to Tanner 2 much earlier now, probably even 8 or 9. Some kids are already developing sexually, especially girls. And so I would say probably around 9 or 10 is the time where you should be, once you see your child is maturing and they have sexual development, that's when you should bring up a little bit of the conversation and talk to them. You know, now you're turning into it, and some of them don't like it. You tell them, you know, you're turning into a young lady. Yeah. And that's preparing you. God's preparing you to be a mom someday and to be a wife someday. And then it's much better if you bring the conversation in little by little, so you don't like kill them with so much information that they want to die. So you just make sure that you fit what you're saying to their development. If they're not interested at all, usually it's because they're not curious about it, but you still want to bring in where they are physically into the conversation, and that'll make such a much better segue into being able to talk about it. And then they will realize that, oh, mom's cool with this. She'll talk about these things. Your dad is cool with it. It's usually a mom more than a dad, but if for boys, it might be dad that needs to make that bridge.
And if I could add to that, I had a conversation with my son actually today about this topic, and I would tell you every time we have this conversation with him, he doesn't want to have it. He's embarrassed by it. So today, me and my wife was talking to him about it, and this was his expression the whole time. Oh my God, why are we having this conversation? But for us, it's more than just checking the box. You know, we share with him, we want to make sure he's 16, he's in high school. We want to make sure that he made healthy decisions. And if he chooses to have his first experience, we want to make sure that he do the right thing and that he's thinking about his health as he, you know, consider these options. And so, but it's an embarrassing conversation that he does not like having with us.
Yeah, I think you touched on something, Rose and I wanted to make a comment based on yours, Michael, and also Dr. Rose. The whole conversation with our sons, like my son did not want to hear anything about sex from me. It was always this thing, why are you talking to me about this? Mom, I already know, or, you know, I can always ask my friends. I mean, I had brothers who could talk to him about it, but he definitely didn't want to hear about it from me. And when he went to college, I would call him. I'm like, hey, do you need me to send you some condoms? He was like, for real? I'm not going to talk about you, talk about this with you. If I need some, I'll take care of it. But I think it's very important definitely to have that conversation, whether they're uncomfortable or not, because I believe once they get our age, they will appreciate that, because there are things that they're going to come to learn, and the information from their peers are not as accurate as it would be coming from us as adults and their parents, And also, Dr. Rose, you made a comment that Rosemary and I were having a conversation about when it comes to the children who are learning their bodies. and when to find concern. And this is probably going to come up later in the conversation, but since you mentioned it, I wanted to bring it up as well. When does it go from exploratory to when a parent is actually concerned about whether or not there has been some sort of adverse experience that has taken place with our children? So that is something we're going to talk about later. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Also, what am I supposed? I wanted to talk about birth control. So I guess we'll just kind of roll into that. So we're talking about whether or not, you know, our sons and giving them sexual health information. How do we have that conversation with our daughters, especially when we have a tomboy or we have a daughter who doesn't seem interested in sex, but you can see that boys are interested in her, that some of her friends are under peer pressure, and, you know, how that may roll over. So any of you are more than welcome to comment on that. Yeah? Hello? Okay, Dr. Rose.
Okay. So there was that was such good information that came from what you were saying. So I went in like 10 different directions. Like, wow, that just gave me food for thought. But another thing, one really important point is that when you don't, as a parent, introduce the topic of sex to your children when they are developing, you leave that child vulnerable, and that's really important. Because the child needs to understand that they do have a future sexuality and it's being developed, and that people might take advantage of that sexuality because not everybody's a good person. And so when you don't explain to your child that you know, these are very important, God-given, I'm a Christian person, so I always bring God into it, especially when I talk to a child, because a child is very naive, very willing to listen to things about God, so that I'll bring that into the topic, and the parents want to think that their children are being protected by God. But what I'll tell the parents is that, look, talk about it first, and talk about it understanding that some people are not good, and some people might take advantage of your child's naive nature. So that these are parts of your body that really should be well taken care of and guarded, because otherwise you don't know, you know, a neighbor or somebody might be the first sexual contact that your child had, and that would be a terrible thing. That's very difficult for us to imagine that somebody would do that. And you know, if you have a dad like Mike and you have a girl, that you don't want to have to hurt anybody, so that you want to pave the way so that your child knows how to protect him or herself from that kind of that kind of I wouldn't want to call it relationship, but that kind of approach. So that's really important once they get to that age, and even earlier than that. One of the things I say in the practice is that your mom and your dad can watch you or see you, you know, when I'm looking at their little bodies, but that most people shouldn't be able to do that, and that's because this is private. This is yours to keep, and this is a very important part of yourself. And so remember that it is important to broach these subjects, even though we feel uncomfortable, but before they become teenagers. And so if you've left that to, you know, they're already teenagers and there they are, very robust and very sexual, and you haven't broached it, I think that you're sort of behind the curve, but that doesn't mean you can't fix it. But you really have to start broaching that conversation and saying, have you noticed that the boys or girls are looking at you, and you know you're very pretty, and you're going to get that kind of interest, and so you need to be able to be the one to open that conversation up.
Yes, yes. And just to acknowledge some of our viewers on Facebook, Faith Cottrell, she said it's not an easy conversation to have with our children. And because most of us have not learned it from our parents, you know, it's like that approach. How do we take that approach? And we know our level of discomfort when we were younger, because talking to my grandma, I was raised by my grandma. That was not a conversation we were going to have. At least not one where I wouldn't be picking myself up off the floor or something to that degree. So, you know, having those fears within us, knowing how it was for us, and translating that to our children. Now, question, can I safely say that all three of you have had this conversation with your children? Of course, if they're of age? Yes? Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
so I want to address the question around birth control. And so I would just, and I'm just going to talk from experience, between, for me and my wife, so I met my wife. We've been married for 17 years. We dated, 10 years before we got married. We met, at a university. We both come from, we're both people of faith. And for us, while we were intimate before, marriage, we were very, very concerned about having kids before marriage. And it was primarily because we both were not in a financial position to bring a young person into this world. So for us being two young college students, she decided to go on birth control. And I supported that, and I think it was the right thing to do. And then once we got married and our careers began to take off, we decided to have children. So I'm not saying that everybody should do that. I would say that worked for me and my wife, and that adults and parents should have these honest conversations with their kids about options, particularly if they're engaging in sex.
Yeah, one of our viewers from Facebook also says, we can't be afraid to answer the questions or explain things to our children. At this point in day and age, there is no more taboo subjects. Everything is all out there on the table because they're going to hear about it one way or the other. And as responsible parents and parents who want to guide their children in the right direction, we have to be willing to answer those questions openly and honestly. But most importantly, we have to develop a relationship with our kids where they know they can trust us and come to us with that. And I've seen situations where children are fearful of coming to their parents with honest questions about their sexuality, questions about life itself. So that's...
Can I throw something out? I remember about 2 years ago, as a nonprofit leader, there was a group of nurses that came to my office and asked if I would be a public face for raising money for menstrual products. And I immediately told them no, because I remember saying, well, I don't think I'm the right person, and I didn't feel comfortable doing it. So I remember going back home, and my wife said, why would you not be the right person? You have 2 daughters. You're the CEO of Boys and Girls Clubs of Dane County. You're going to get out there and you're going to raise money to make sure that young people in our schools have access to menstrual products. And then once I started hearing about these stories of young girls being arrested at Walgreens or CVS because they were afraid to go to school because purchasing menstrual products was a barrier, we were like, this is something that we should be doing. And we ended up securing, I think, 200,000 menstrual products in a matter of 72 hours. So even as men, we have to do a better job advocating, stepping up, speaking up, and putting ourselves out there to support our young people in the community around these sensitive subjects.
So did you go back and say yes?
Let me tell you, I was so glad we did it. And I learned a lot, in the process. And to see, I think the first 200 or 300, so what we did, I slept outside all night, and I asked men in our community to bring me tampons and menstrual products. And within 24 hours, we literally had 200,000 boxes out there. And then we distributed, all those menstrual products to the schools and gave them directly to the nurses to make sure that that was no longer a barrier for kids in our schools.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that. I love to hear that men are stepping up and taking a role in the development of their daughters' health and well-being when it comes to things like that. Because again, men buying tampons used to be this whole thing like, it's not happening over here. Let my wife get her own, So we did have a couple more questions. Dr. Rose, wanted to ask you about the misconceptions of birth control. And I do apologize. Ericka, did you want to comment on that whole thing?
taking us in 3 or 4 different directions. So
Okay.
what said was great, but I do want to mention that some of us are women who have been single mothers raising young men.
Mhm.
And important it is to talk to our young men about their sexual health, protecting their bodies, their body parts, and how for them to be responsible in the way of birth control as well. I want to hold up the conversation. You guys hit it all.
I think that's a great point, because I'm definitely guilty of being more focused on educating my son about women, about, you know, the things to respect, the things to recognize, the things not to be afraid of, those things. So I was teaching them more of that, as opposed to, of course, their own body sexual health, because I don't know a lot about that. But I do want to teach them how to interact with women when it comes to sexual health and things not to be afraid of, like yeast infections. I won't say not to be afraid of, but things to be aware of, like yeast infections and things like that. So, oh goodness, we have about 20 minutes left, and we are definitely going to move into the parent portion too. But Dr. Rose, if you could answer that question about misperceptions.
No, that's really important. And first of all, they need to understand that birth control is not necessarily the same thing as protecting yourselves from sexually transmitted diseases and infections, because there's a misconception that if you are on the pill, or if you're getting the depot shot or the implant, that therefore you don't have the risk of having sexual transmitted diseases. And that's there could be nothing further away from the truth. They also need to understand that condoms help. It's better than not using anything by far. But on the other hand, they're not 100% protective against sexual transmitted diseases. So they need to understand that with the start of sexual behavior, there is risk. That doesn't mean that oh, don't do anything. It means that you have to understand that there is risk involved to sexual activity, and that they also need to understand that the biggest risk really is the risk of the heart. When you give yourself to somebody sexually, you are really embracing that person, especially as a girl. Boys too, but girls so much more. And so that's important for them to understand, that with sexual activity comes risk. And so you have to sort of put your head around that, so that you understand that when you have adult behavior, that you're going to have adult consequences at the same time. But that because they just went to the doctor and got a depo, or they got on the birth control pill or the implant, that does not mean that they're not going to be exposed to sexually transmitted infections. That's really important for our kids to understand. And there are a lot of infections, so you can talk about a little bit about that, or you can ask for your pediatrician to help you bring that out. I'm more than happy. Like many parents will bring me their children and say, you know, I don't know the whole gist of it. Would you talk to my kid? And I'm so happy to do that because some parents are uncomfortable. But do you have an older not a younger brother or sister that's more like in tune to being able to talk about that you can rely on? Maybe that person can talk a little bit more openly about sexual matters to your child. But it has to be somebody that you feel very comfortable that your kid can relate to, and will do a good job of addressing those.
Yes, I totally agree. I wanted to ask a question specifically of Ericka. So as the CEO of the CYC, are there any initiatives at your organization that you have in place to support healthy relationships?
Most certainly. CYC had been founded more than 30 years ago on the premise of caring adults in the lives of young people. That's always our main thrust, and doing that via mentoring. Though a great majority of our initiatives do focus on academia, we will always be focused on social emotional support with young folks. We're doing a great deal of work right now related to trauma-informed care.
Great.
how we are affected as people, just in general, with trauma and what happens with us. So we have a complete curriculum starting with elementary aged young people that again deal with peer relationships, getting to know ourselves, self-esteem. Programs targeted at young women, particularly, and the whole menstrual issue that was just brought up a few minutes ago is all hot topic there. There's also a program focused for young men and helping them to be the gentlemen that they can be. We do host and hold something called MAP, M-A-P, Mentoring Assistance Platform. And right now it is so critical. It's a virtual opportunity, a virtual platform for mentors and mentees to communicate with one another well more than on an academic platform and helping our kids succeed in the classroom, but emotional and social supports are needed for them, emotional supports in their homes and in their daily lives right now. Always connecting young people with the resources that are necessary in the community, whether it's in their churches or schools or other community partners in that. So
wonderful.
Gamut of supports related to young folks and their social emotional support.
Now that sounds like it covers like the gamut of everything. So you guys definitely have all the resources that young people could use. So that's the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative.
That is the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative, and we could not do it without our community partners. And so we're always appreciative of our supports in the community and our relationship.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. So I want to move on to some of our viewer questions. They've got some questions out there, and so I'm hoping that you all can help us out with this and help them with that. So they have a question. Something actually we touched on earlier, Dr. Rose, is they said, my child is masturbating. What should I do? Should I look for signs of abuse or is it normal?
That's a great question. I do get a lot of parents ask me that, especially the parents of girls are especially concerned about it. Boys, obviously, you sort of understand that's normal, but the girls, with that, there's the concern that it could be because the child has been molested. But most of the time it's not. And most of the time it is just normal behavior. And you sort of need to explain to the child what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And that touching yourself or masturbating in public is not a good thing. I did have one really cute story to share about one mom who saw her little daughter masturbating, and she was sort of doing this and doing it more. And she addressed it with her little girl, and she said, well, you know, that's not appropriate to do in public. So that's private stuff that you do privately. And so the next day, the little girl stands up and she says, I'm going to my bedroom now. And so she's 6. And so mom said, so what are you doing over there? Oh, you told me that it was not right to masturbate in public. So I'm just going to go to my bedroom and do it. So it was, she got that part. She just said, this is taking my time. I'm going to go. Kids take things very literally. So if you're going to explain something to a child, they're very literal. So she said, you said not in public. I'm going to my bedroom.
Yeah.
You need to delineate what is okay and what is okay to say and what's not okay to say to your child. But yes, for the most part, mostly everybody that I've seen that behavior with, it's normal. Once in a while, when you see something excessive or you see them being mean or spiteful or hurting themselves, then they might have been abused, or sexually abused or physically abused, or might have seen something. A child that's, let's say 5 or 6 and is trying to sort of look like they're having sex with another person, that's different. They didn't know that behavior. So that says that they saw something or they were part of something that was inappropriate for that age.
Okay, I hope that answered your question out there in our viewership. I hope that answered your question. So as we're talking about that, We also have a question about giving nicknames to private parts. Have any of you done that as you were teaching your children about their bodies? And is it okay to give our parts a nickname when you're talking to your children, or should we be straightforward and use those medical terms, those clinical terms? Ericka, do you use nicknames, or do you just?
The doctor to tell me if I did this right or not. See, because it's been a long time for me, right?
It's all right. It's all right. Yes.
I've always been a proponent of teaching our young people to be well versed in our language and being able to talk in clear terms and talk about things that are. And so I never got into the nicknames of PP or PP or any of those things, except as age appropriate. So you can't lay a great deal of information that a young person can't understand cognitively on them, so it has to be age appropriate. But as appropriate, I've always taught my young person and other young people that I interact with proper terms and proper names and their functions. And I think that's critically important. I started off by talking about clear, concise, open dialogue. And so rather than confuse something with nicknames and that, I never really did. It's been so long, but when I think back, only as age appropriate and not to overwhelm a child with technical terms or anything like that. But I never wanted to do something and then undo it and say, well, what I really meant was this word and not that word, or, so again, let tell me if I were correct 15 or so years ago.
Okay. So doctor, is that okay?
Oh yeah, sounds very appropriate. Just remember that if you teach a 5-year-old a word, it's going to come back at you.
That is right.
Yes. I think though, if you do use those clinical terms with young children, and you're teaching them to use it in a respectful way. So it's not something that's going to be used in a derogatory way or referring to something inappropriate, because it's the medical term, and it is what it is. Michael, did you have any issues with that, or how did you do it?
So I would say, growing up where I grew up at, everybody had a nickname for everything, including those parts of your body. But I would agree with my fellow panelists. When I talk to my kids about it, or we have discussions about sexual education, where I say you call it what it is, and educate our young people on what the actual terms are. So I would say do it the right way. But if it's age appropriate, you may have to. So I agree with the other two panelists.
Okay. We also have another question. Time is rolling. Oh my gosh, there's so much we could talk about. Okay, so we have another question. It says, my daughter is 17. Her boyfriend is 19, and I allow him to stay over. Should I be doing this? Oh, I heard a lot of mms. Who wants to take it on?
What's an answer? He has daughters.
So,
yeah, Michael.
So I would say if it was me, I don't want to. I would say I lived it, right? When I was in high school, when I was younger, my mom did not allow me to have girls over. But then she met a young lady that I went to high school with, and she allowed her to stay. There were some pros and some cons to that. If my daughter came home or my son came home now and said I wanted to have a live-in girlfriend, I would probably say no. But depending on what the circumstances are, if it was my son or daughter and the person was coming from an abusive situation, didn't have a place to live, and there was other circumstances, I probably would consider it, but I would probably lean on the side of saying no at that age.
Gotcha. I think things have definitely changed in these times, because I have my son in high school. I did allow his friends to stay over, male and female, but I think that's also a great time to have that conversation, the talk again, and then have that conversation and set expectations with the guest as well. So definitely. All right, so we're going to go on with a couple more viewer questions. Question, my 11-year-old may be having sex. What do I do? And it doesn't say whether it was a girl or a boy, but
I'll take that one. That's too young. As a pediatrician, I can tell you that that is not developmentally appropriate for an 11-year-old to have sex, and that something happened along the way where the child was introduced to sex when the child, for the most part, and I'm talking about 99.9% of children at the age of 11, even 12, I mean, you just come into maybe at 13, they start to be with it sexually enough to really understand it. But at 11, it's way too young. So that child has a really high chance of having a lot of detrimental effects, physically and emotionally, from having sex. So the best thing to do at that point is get to the bottom of it. Who are you having sex with? Is it your age? And hopefully they are the same age and they're just experimenting. But if it's an older child or a person that's having sex with your child, you just need to follow the correct order of events from there. But developmentally, it's way too young. Because you need to be hormonally, but also mentally ready for sex. And 11 is not where you are.
So would you say that there's a good possibility that something has happened to that child that would have put them in a state of mind to even think about or participate in having sex at that age?
I would agree with that. That either somebody is taking advantage of that child, or that the child has seen something or had something done to them. Where he's been initiated sexually, because it's just not something that an 11-year-old would be normally interested in having that kind of relationship.
Anyone else want to interject on that?
I agree with 95% of everything the good doctor said. I would say at that age, while I totally agree it's not appropriate for kids to have sex, but I also know there's a lot of curious young people and they are exposed to an abundance of sexual activity in the media, whether it's social media and on TV. And I see so many kids having kids at that age. And some of it I just think is kids exploring, but I don't think it's the right thing to do. I think it's wrong in some cases. Something probably did happen to that young person. I think some of it is they're experimenting far too young to be doing those kinds of activities. So that's my 2 cents.
I would agree. So would you also, and this is to all of the panelists, would you say for a female, if you have a daughter, that having that conversation about sex, having the talk would be something that you would do when she starts her cycle? Is that a good time?
I would personally do it before that.
Before
like
that?
I said, once you get the initial sexual development, so if the child has already had the cycle, you're probably a little bit behind the curve. So I would say probably before that. I would say probably it should be around 9 or 9, 10, or 11.
Okay.
It's better, because you want to be ahead of it by a little bit, so that they're already opening up their interest or curiosity.
Okay. All right. Well, I have another viewer question. I'm going to direct this one to Michael, because the question's about her 15-year-old daughter. And she says, I checked my 15-year-old daughter's cell phone and internet messages, which I think is great to do. And she said, yes, it's an invasion of her privacy, but I found disturbing messages to a boy. What should I do with that information? And am I in a place to possibly get birth control on her behalf?
Yeah, so some people would probably, disagree with me on this, but as long as my kids live in my household and I'm paying their phone bills and I'm feeding them, they're not gonna have their privacy. If I feel that something could cause harm to them, yes, I'm going to check their phones. Yes, I'm going to check their emails, and my kids know that. In this particular case, if she found something that is alarming to her, she should have a brutally honest, direct, transparent conversation with her kids or her child. And if she's not the right person, she should try to facilitate that conversation with somebody that her child may respect and feel open having that conversation with. What I would probably encourage her to do, sometimes parents will start screaming and cursing, and I would say just take a chill pill for a couple of hours, really think through how you're gonna have that brutally honest conversation. And again, if you gotta bring in another person, do it. I would tell you, I experienced, my daughter just went, had her first cycle, and she didn't come to me. She went to her auntie and she went to her mom, and I found out about it through my wife. But I was glad that my daughter felt comfortable having that conversation with somebody. And I also had a nephew who experienced something like that, and I was asked to be a part of that conversation because his mom was not comfortable having that conversation. So being vulnerable and being open and having a real conversation with your child, I think is very, very important.
It is. It is. That whole trust thing is an issue there. So time is flying. Ooh. So we're definitely going to have to bring this this conversation to an end. It is my hope that Rosemary or any of you may host something like this again, because there's so many unanswered questions that we still have. But in closing, I did want to ask a final question and put a reminder out there to everyone that Rosemary's Babies Company provides support for teen parents. So these young people, especially the girls, are often stereotyped and labeled because they're young teen parents. And most have experienced trauma, have lacked education from parents, and did not properly use birth control, and etc. So my question, our final question is, what would you say to a person that may judge a young parent, or to a person who may want to support the cause, but does not want to appear to support the teen pregnancy issue? And so I'd really like for each of you to take a brief moment to answer that question, if you could. And we start with Ericka, please.
You already questions up front. I think that first and foremost, what I would say to a person that would be stereotypical to any young person, especially in the world that we live in today, stop, halt, not necessary, don't do that. This is a community approach. Every single thing that we do should be done from a community perspective with the end goal for the best result for every one of our kids. Period. I know that we all have, whether it's our own culture or our own belief system or the otherwise, where we're deemed to think differently about different situations or different causes. And I would dare anybody to judge anybody about anything. That's it for me. So I would just ask that our community embrace every one of our kids. I would suggest that we use collective resources to support every person that we can. And one thing that I'm learning as I grow older, and as my son is now an adult who will at some point be on his own, is you can stand to learn something from young people always. Every situation for folks is different. Just because I have a set of circumstance doesn't mean the next person does. And who am I to judge? And life's a journey. It's a long span. And if we, all come together, and I'm not singing kumbaya or anything, but on the flip side, I am. We need each other. And there's nothing more important to me than the lives of our young people.
Thank you.
And we owe it to them to educate them and allow them to stand on our shoulders.
Yeah, definitely.
We're still trying to. So it's a collective community.
Thank you. It takes a village. Dr. Rose, your input?
Yes, thank you. So I had like a very broad way of seeing it, is that we personally don't want for our kids to be pregnant when they're teenagers. That's why it's teenage prevention. But on the other hand, there's a stigma with it that is difficult for the teenagers. So it's both things. We want to prevent our teenagers from getting pregnant and from engaging in behavior that's going to be detrimental to them. But we also want to, when the child does engage in them, they do get pregnant, or they have sexually transmitted infections, or they have other side effects or consequences of their behavior. We do want them to, we want the adults in their community and in their environment to love them in spite of everything. I say a lot of that to the parents. I said, you have to learn to love your child no matter what. And for it to really sincerely come across that way. And the more people that you have like that in the community that won't say, well, see, I told you so. But we'll say, it makes me sad, but I love you no matter what, and we're going to get through this together, and it's going to be part of your growing process, and we're going to make the best of this, because that child that's going to be born is going to be a blessing and to somebody's life. It might be your own life. Yeah. And so at that point, we have to sort of change the dynamics of how we see that teenage pregnancy, and we say, oops, it's me. It happened to my child or my grandchild or my neighbor. And then you have to accept it that way, because these are our kids. Yes. And yes. We're going to grow that child up, and we're going to learn to accept it. And at the same time, have them understand, because that young child might get pregnant again, is that we don't want to be here again. Thank you for giving me this wonderful gift, but I don't want to have to go through this with you again. So we're going to take measures so that it doesn't happen. So it's sort of a big, expansive thing.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry, Michael, we do have just a couple minutes left, but I definitely want to get your input on this. So please, the floor is yours.
I'll just close out and just say, as somebody that has worked with young people for over 20 years and working with young people and adults from every walk of life, I'll leave on this note. Instead of casting stones and judging people, remember this quote: seek understanding instead of being understood, and it'll take you a long way.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very wonderful thing to close out on. And I want to ask each of you if you would be interested in returning to continue this conversation at some point. I think all of you have had some very valuable input, and our audience could definitely benefit from more of your knowledge. So would you all be willing to come back?
Absolutely.
Yay! I am so glad to hear that. I would love for you all to briefly give us your contact information, maybe an email address or something, where some of our viewers may be able to reach out to you. So email address from you, Ericka?
Yes, my email address is edansby@cycyouth.org, and we can be found on the web at www.cycyouth.org.
Perfect, perfect. And I guess to make that easier, thank you for that, Ericka. Dr. Rose, your website.
Yes, I have ROSEMARY'S MD is my website, but a really good active page that we have is our Facebook page. It's also ROSEMARY'S MD or Rosemary Fernandez Stein. And that's a very active site that we just try to educate parents and young adults on about matters of life and taking care of yourself.
Thank you. And Michael.
My email address is mjohnson@bgcdc, so that's Boy Girl Club, DC as in Dane County.org. You can Google us and find us on Twitter at BGCDC. And you can find us on pretty much all the social media platforms. My office number is 608-257-2606.
Perfect. And of course, all of you know how to reach out to Rosemary's Babies Companies, because you are watching us on Rosemary Babies Companies page. I have been your moderator for the evening. I am very thankful to have had a wonderful panel, the interaction from our viewing audience, and I encourage you all to keep watching and for Rosemary to post more events just like this one. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Have a great night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.